"Mom, we found a wonderful place for you," my daughter said over brunch, sliding a glossy nursing home brochure across the table as casually as if she were recommending a new coffee shop. For a moment, I simply stared at the smiling gray-haired couple on the cover. They stood hand in hand beside a landscaped fountain, looking perfectly content. The words "Luxury Senior Living" were printed across the top in elegant gold letters. I was 71 years old, not blind, not confused, and certainly not looking for someone to decide where I belonged. Yet there it was, sitting between my blueberry pancakes and a cup of coffee that had suddenly gone cold. My name is Margaret Dawson, and until that Sunday morning, I thought I understood my daughter better than anyone. Looking back now, I realized that was my first mistake. I'm glad you're here. Stay with me until the end, and tell me where you're watching from, because what happened after that brunch changed the way I looked at family forever. The restaurant was one of Jennifer's favorites, a bright little place overlooking the river. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, bouncing off polished wood tables and making everything appear warm and welcoming. Families laughed around us. Servers carried plates piled high with waffles and eggs. It should have felt normal. Instead, something about the brochure made the entire room seem strangely distant. Jennifer smiled as she folded her hands neatly in front of her. "I know this might seem sudden," she said gently, "but Mark and I have been talking, and we just want what's best for you." "What's best for me?" Those 4 words settled heavily in my chest. I looked at my daughter carefully. At 44, Jennifer had perfected the expression of concern. Her blue eyes widened at exactly the right moments. Her voice softened whenever she wanted something. Most people found her charming. For years, I had too. "What's wrong with where I live now?" I asked. She laughed lightly. "Nothing's wrong, Mom. We just think it might be time to start planning ahead." Planning ahead. Another harmless phrase that somehow felt dangerous. I took a sip of coffee and glanced down at the brochure. Again, the photographs showed elegant dining rooms, exercise classes, and residents playing cards. It was all very pleasant. Too pleasant. "I'm doing fine," I said. "I still drive. I volunteer twice a week. I walk 3 miles every morning." Jennifer nodded quickly. "Of course you do. Nobody's saying you can't take care of yourself." But the way she said it sounded exactly like someone saying I couldn't. The conversation drifted to other topics after that. Jennifer talked about work. She mentioned a home renovation project. She complained about rising property taxes. I listened, nodded, and smiled when appropriate. Yet my attention kept returning to the brochure resting beside my plate. Something about it felt rehearsed, planned, deliberate. Then I noticed something else. Jennifer seemed unusually interested in my answers whenever money came up. Had I renewed my homeowner's insurance? Was I still using the same financial advisor? Had I considered downsizing? Small questions. Innocent questions. The kind daughters might ask aging parents every day. But hearing them all together made my stomach tighten. When the check arrived, Jennifer reached for it immediately. "I've got this," she said. As we stood to leave, she touched my arm. "Just think about it, okay? No pressure. No pressure." I smiled and tucked the brochure into my purse. "I'll think about it." That answer seemed to satisfy her. She hugged me goodbye in the parking lot and drove away. I remained beside my car for several moments, watching her disappear into traffic. The autumn air felt cool against my skin. A breeze carried a few golden leaves across the asphalt. Everything looked perfectly ordinary. But deep inside, something had shifted. During the drive home, I replayed every word of the conversation. Every smile, every carefully chosen phrase. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. The brochure wasn't the beginning of the conversation. It was the next step in a plan that had already been unfolding for some time. I just didn't know what the plan was yet. As I walked toward my front door, I glanced back at the house my late husband and I had built together. 33 years earlier. The white shutters needed repainting. The flower beds needed attention before winter arrived. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. And for the first time, I found myself wondering whether someone else had already started making plans for it. That evening, I placed the brochure on my kitchen counter and tried to continue with my normal routine. I watered the small herb garden outside my window, answered a few emails from the community charity where I volunteered, and prepared a simple dinner. Yet no matter what I did, my thoughts kept circling back to Jennifer. For years after my husband Thomas passed away, I had built a quiet, stable life. Every morning I woke up at 6, walked 3 miles through the neighborhood, and stopped at the same coffee shop on Thursdays where the owner already knew my order. I managed my own finances, maintained my house, and handled every appointment without assistance. I was not merely surviving. I was living. That was why the conversation at brunch felt so strange. The next morning, I sat on my back porch with a cup of coffee and began thinking about the past few months. Once I started paying attention, small details surfaced one after another. Jennifer had begun calling more often. At first, I appreciated it. What mother would not enjoy hearing from her daughter? But the conversations were rarely about family memories or everyday life. Somehow, they always drifted toward practical matters. She wanted to know whether I had updated my will. She asked if I still kept copies of important documents in the house. She wondered whether maintaining a property this size was becoming stressful. At the time, I assumed she was simply concerned. Now I was not so sure. Around noon, I opened a drawer in my home office and reviewed a folder containing insurance papers, tax records, and property information. Nothing was missing. Everything appeared normal. Even so, I felt an uneasy pressure building in the back of my mind. It was the feeling that comes when pieces of a puzzle exist but refuse to fit together. Later that afternoon, I met my friend Carol for coffee. Carol and I had known each other for nearly 20 years. She had an excellent memory and an even better ability to notice things other people overlooked. We talked about ordinary matters for a while before I casually mentioned the brunch. Carol listened quietly as I described the brochure. When I finished, she stirred her coffee and looked at me carefully. "Margaret, can I ask you something?" she said. "Of course. Has Jennifer been having financial problems?" The question caught me off guard. "Not that I know of." Carol hesitated. "I only asked because my niece works at a real estate office downtown. A few weeks ago, she mentioned that a woman named Jennifer Miller was asking questions about property values in your neighborhood." I felt my stomach tighten. "My neighborhood?" Carol nodded. "She specifically asked about homes similar to yours." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The sounds of the coffee shop seemed to fade into the background. I stared out the window at passing traffic while Carol's words settled in my mind. There could have been an innocent explanation. Perhaps Jennifer was helping a friend. Perhaps it was a coincidence. Yet deep down, I knew why the information disturbed me. It connected too neatly with everything else. The phone calls, the questions, the brochure. That evening, after returning home, I stood in my living room and slowly looked around. Family photographs lined the shelves. Thomas smiled back at me from a framed picture taken during our 40th wedding anniversary trip. This house held decades of memories. Suddenly, a thought entered my mind so clearly that I could not ignore it. What if Jennifer was not planning for my future? What if she was planning for hers? The following morning, I decided to stop guessing and start paying attention. For years, I had trusted Jennifer completely. Trust has a way of filling in missing information with comforting assumptions. Once that trust begins to crack, however, every detail looks different. I spent the day going about my usual routine, but I observed everything with new eyes. Shortly after 10 o'clock, my phone rang. It was Jennifer. Her voice sounded unusually cheerful. She asked how I was feeling, whether I had slept well, and whether I had thought any more about the retirement community. The question arrived so quickly that it almost felt rehearsed. I told her I was still considering it. There was a brief pause before she responded. It was only a second or two, but it was enough. She sounded disappointed. Not concerned. Disappointed. After the call ended, I sat quietly in my home office and stared at the framed photograph of Thomas on my desk. My husband had always been good at reading people. During our 43 years together, he noticed things long before I did. I could almost hear him saying, "Slow down and look at the facts." So that is exactly what I did. Over the next few days, I began noticing patterns. Jennifer called nearly every day. Each conversation eventually circled back to practical matters. She asked whether I had scheduled any major home repairs. She asked whether I planned to travel. She asked whether I still handled all my investments personally. None of the questions were inappropriate on their own. Together, however, they formed a picture I could no longer ignore. Then something happened that pushed my concerns even further. On Wednesday afternoon, I stopped by the grocery store after volunteering at the community center. As I walked through the produce section, I ran into an old acquaintance named Robert Ellis. Robert had spent more than 30 years working in residential real estate before retiring. We exchanged pleasantries and spoke for several minutes. During the conversation, he casually mentioned that he had recently seen Jennifer. The comment caught my attention immediately. "Jennifer?" I asked. "Yes," he said. "Very nice conversation." She had questions about market conditions in your neighborhood. I felt a chill despite the warm store. Questions about what exactly? Robert shrugged. Property values. Buyer demand. Things like that. I assumed she was helping you evaluate options. I smiled politely and changed the subject, but my thoughts raced all the way home. This was the second person who had independently mentioned Jennifer asking questions connected to real estate. Coincidences happen. Multiple coincidences surrounding the same subject are harder to dismiss. That evening, I opened my laptop and reviewed public property records connected to my home. Everything remained exactly as it should have been. Nothing had changed. Still, I found myself wondering whether Jennifer believed something was about to change. The next clue arrived 2 days later. She invited me to dinner at her house. During the meal, she seemed unusually interested in discussing future plans. She talked about simplifying life, reducing responsibilities, and making transitions easier before emergencies occurred. Mark remained mostly silent throughout the conversation. Several times, I noticed him glance toward Jennifer before speaking, as though he was carefully choosing his words. By the time I drove home that night, one truth had become impossible to ignore. Jennifer was not preparing for a possibility. She was preparing for an outcome she expected to happen soon. The question that kept me awake long after midnight was simple. Why was she acting so confident that my future had already been decided? The next week, I stopped treating my concerns as suspicions and started treating them as questions that deserved answers. One advantage of reaching 71 is that people often underestimate you. They assume you are slower than you are, less observant, easier to distract. I had spent more than 3 decades managing budgets, reviewing contracts, and finding mistakes hidden in thousands of pages of paperwork. If something was happening behind my back, I knew how to follow a trail. On Monday morning, I called my attorney, Susan Reed. Susan had handled legal matters for Thomas and me for nearly 20 years. She was intelligent, careful, and not easily surprised. I asked whether she had time for lunch later that week. She agreed immediately. I did not explain my concerns over the phone. Some conversations are better held face to face. 3 days later, we met at a quiet restaurant near her office. After ordering salads and iced tea, I told her everything. The brochure, the repeated questions, the conversations about my house, the sudden interest in my future. Susan listened without interrupting. When I finished, she folded her hands and looked at me. Thoughtfully, "Has Jennifer ever asked to review your estate documents?" she asked. "Not directly," I said, "but she has become very interested in where everything is kept." Susan nodded slowly. That alone does not prove anything. But I agree that the timing is unusual. She asked several more questions. Had I signed any new documents recently? Had anyone requested access to my financial records? Had I noticed unusual activity involving my accounts? The answer to all 3 questions was no. Still, Susan seemed concerned enough to suggest a complete review of my legal files. I agreed. After lunch, we walked to her office and spent nearly 2 hours examining documents. Everything appeared exactly as it should have. Yet just as I began wondering whether I had overreacted, Susan discovered something unexpected. It was not a major issue. In fact, most people would have overlooked it entirely. About 6 months earlier, someone had contacted her office requesting general information regarding procedures for transferring property ownership after a parent entered long-term residential care. The request had not included authorization to discuss my personal records, so no information had been released. However, the name attached to the inquiry immediately caught my attention. Jennifer Miller, my daughter. The room became very quiet. Susan removed her glasses and set them on her desk. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, I asked the question that had been growing heavier inside me for days. Why would she ask that? Susan chose her words carefully. There could be innocent explanations, but combined with everything else you have described, I think you should remain cautious. Cautious. The word lingered in my mind during the drive home. As I turned into my driveway, I noticed a familiar vehicle parked across the street. It belonged to Mark. That was unusual because Jennifer had told me earlier that week they would both be out of town. I parked quietly and remained inside my car for a moment. Mark appeared to be speaking with someone standing beside a black sport utility vehicle. I could not hear their conversation. After a minute, they shook hands and separated. The other vehicle drove away. Mark noticed me almost immediately. His expression changed. Only for a second, but it changed. Then he smiled and waved. I waved back. As I walked toward my front door, a realization settled over me. For the first time, I was no longer asking whether something was happening. I knew something was. The only mystery remaining was how far Jennifer had already gone to turn her plans into reality. Over the next several days, I resisted the urge to confront Jennifer. That was not easy. Every unanswered question seemed to grow heavier with each passing hour. Yet experience had taught me something important. People reveal more when they believe they are safe. If Jennifer thought I was suspicious, she would become careful. If she believed I was simply an aging mother considering her advice, she would continue exactly as she had been. So I smiled during our phone calls. I thanked her for caring. I even asked a few questions about retirement communities. The change in her attitude was immediate. She sounded relieved. More than relieved. She sounded encouraged. That reaction told me more than any argument ever could. A few days later, Susan called and asked me to stop by her office. Her tone was calm, but I could tell she had found something. When I arrived, she handed me a folder and pointed to several documents. Most of the information was public. Some came from financial disclosures connected to property records and business filings. Together, they painted a picture that I had never expected to see. Jennifer and Mark were carrying significantly more debt than I realized. There was nothing illegal about it. Many families struggle financially from time to time, but the numbers surprised me. Credit balances, refinancing activity, several large loans connected to renovation projects and investments that apparently had not gone as planned. I sat quietly as Susan explained the timeline. Much of the financial pressure had appeared within the last 2 years. The same period during which Jennifer's interest in my affairs had increased dramatically. Suddenly, the pieces began fitting together. The repeated questions about my property, the discussions about simplifying my life, the inquiries about ownership transfers. None of it appeared random anymore. You think she is trying to gain control of the house, Susan said carefully. I think she sees your assets as a solution to problems she does not know how to solve. I looked down at the folder resting on the desk. The realization hurt more than I expected. Not because of the money, because of what it suggested about trust. I had always believed that family should be built on honesty, even when people disagreed, even when circumstances became difficult. Yet the picture emerging in front of me suggested something very different. Jennifer was not treating me like a mother whose future needed protection. She was treating me like an asset that needed management. On the drive home, I found myself remembering small moments from years earlier. Jennifer asking for advice before major decisions. Jennifer calling her father whenever she faced a challenge. Jennifer laughing with us during family vacations. I wondered when that version of my daughter had disappeared. Or perhaps she had not disappeared at all. Perhaps financial pressure had simply changed what mattered most to her. Later that evening, my phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Jennifer. She wanted to schedule another family dinner. She said there were important future plans she hoped we could discuss together. I stared at the message for a long time before responding. Important future plans. The words felt almost identical to the language she had been using for weeks. This time, however, I understood what might be hiding underneath them. I replied with a simple yes. Then I set the phone down and looked out the living room window toward the darkening street. For the first time since this began, I no longer wondered what Jennifer wanted. I was beginning to understand her plan. The question now was whether she understood that I had started uncovering it. The dinner took place the following Saturday evening. Jennifer had spent the entire week acting unusually attentive. She called twice to confirm the time. She asked whether I needed help driving over. She even offered to pick me up herself. I politely declined. By then, I had learned to pay attention not only to what she said, but also to why she might be saying it. When I arrived, everything appeared normal. The dining table was beautifully arranged. Candles flickered softly. Mark greeted me with a smile that looked slightly forced. Throughout the meal, Jennifer steered the conversation toward the future. She talked about planning ahead, avoiding unnecessary complications, and making life easier for everyone involved. I listened carefully and revealed very little. The more comfortable she became, the more obvious her confidence appeared. It was as if she believed events were already moving in her favor. By the time I returned home that evening, I realized something important. Jennifer was not worried about whether her plan would succeed. She was worried about how quickly it would happen. 3 days later, Susan called again. Her voice carried a note of curiosity I had not heard before. She asked whether I could come by her office immediately. When I arrived, several thick folders sat open across her conference table. I found something while reviewing older estate records, she said. Something I think your husband intended you to know if circumstances ever became complicated. My heart immediately tightened. Thomas had been gone for 5 years, yet there were still moments when his name could stop me in place. Susan slid a document toward me. The paperwork dated back almost 8 years. At first glance, it looked like a routine trust amendment. Then I noticed Thomas's signature. I read every line slowly. Once, then twice, then a third time. The document revealed a family trust that Thomas had quietly restructured before his death. Most of our assets remained exactly where I expected them to be. However, one section caught my attention immediately. Several years earlier, Jennifer and Mark had needed financial assistance when purchasing their apartment. Thomas had helped them through a legal arrangement designed to protect the property while giving them flexibility. The apartment was not structured the way Jennifer believed it was. According to the trust documents, ownership rights remained connected to the family trust under specific conditions. More importantly, after Thomas passed away, administrative control transferred entirely to me. I looked up at Susan. Jennifer knows about this? Susan slowly shook her head. Based on everything I reviewed, I do not believe she does. The room suddenly felt very quiet. For weeks, I had been trying to understand why Jennifer seemed so confident. Now I was staring at information that completely changed the balance of power. If Jennifer's financial situation was as strained as it appeared, she was likely counting on future access to my assets. Yet she seemed unaware that one of the most important assets in her own life remained connected to decisions only I could make. Susan studied my expression carefully. Margaret, I am not suggesting you do anything drastic. I am simply showing you the full picture. I nodded slowly. The truth was that I had no desire to punish anyone. Despite everything, Jennifer was still my daughter. But understanding the truth and ignoring it were two very different things. As I drove home, memories of Thomas filled my thoughts. He had always believed that preparation mattered more than reaction. He used to say that the strongest position in any difficult situation was knowing something others did not. For the first time since this began, I understood exactly what he meant. Jennifer believed she was guiding events toward a conclusion she had carefully planned. What she did not know was that my late husband had quietly left behind a safeguard years ago, and now that safeguard was sitting in my hands. Once I understood what Thomas had left behind, my entire approach changed. Until then, I had been reacting to clues. Now I had information. More importantly, I had options. The challenge was deciding what to do with them. For several days, I carefully considered every possibility. Part of me wanted to call Jennifer immediately and demand an explanation. Another part wanted to pretend none of this had happened. Neither choice felt right. If I confronted her too soon, she would deny everything and become more cautious. If I ignored it, I would only be giving her additional time to continue whatever plan she had set in motion. In the end, I chose a third option. I decided to watch. The following week, Jennifer invited me to tour a senior living community she claimed was simply worth considering. I agreed without hesitation. The surprise on her face lasted only a moment before she smiled. "That is wonderful, Mom," she said. "I think you will really like it." The facility itself was beautiful. Fresh landscaping, comfortable apartments, friendly staff. There was nothing wrong with the place. That was not the point. Throughout the tour, I paid close attention to Jennifer instead of the building. She seemed unusually enthusiastic. She asked questions about waiting lists, availability, and transition timelines. At one point, she even asked a staff member how quickly a new resident could move in after making a decision. The answer appeared to satisfy her. As we drove back toward town, she seemed happier than I had seen her in months. That alone told me everything I needed to know. She was not exploring possibilities. She was anticipating outcomes. Over the next 2 weeks, I continued playing the role she expected. I asked occasional questions about retirement communities. I mentioned feeling tired after yard work. I even joked that maintaining a large house was becoming more responsibility than it used to be. Every comment appeared to encourage her further. Meanwhile, Susan quietly continued reviewing records. Each new discovery strengthened the same conclusion. Jennifer and Mark were under increasing financial pressure. Their situation was not catastrophic, but it was serious enough to explain why my assets had become so interesting. One afternoon, Susan called with another update. A real estate consultant had recently been contacted regarding valuation estimates connected to properties in my area. Once again, Jennifer's name appeared in the inquiry chain. I thanked Susan and hung up. Then I sat quietly in my living room, looking out at the backyard Thomas and I had spent decades building together. By then, I no longer felt confused. I felt disappointed. There is a difference. Confusion comes from not understanding what is happening. Disappointment comes from understanding it too clearly. A few days later, Jennifer called and asked whether I would be willing to attend a family planning meeting. She explained that she, Mark, and a financial advisor wanted to discuss long-term solutions. I immediately agreed. Her excitement was impossible to miss. She believed she was finally approaching the finish line. What she did not realize was that I had already seen the entire track. After ending the call, I contacted Susan and asked her to reserve the same afternoon on her calendar. Then I opened a drawer in my office and removed a folder containing copies of the trust documents Thomas had left behind. As I carefully reviewed each page, I found myself smiling for the first time in weeks. Not because I wanted revenge, not because I wanted conflict, but because I finally understood something Jennifer did not. She thought she was controlling the future. In reality, she was walking directly toward a conversation she would never see coming. The family planning meeting was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon at Jennifer's house. From the moment I arrived, I could feel the confidence in the room. Jennifer greeted me warmly. Mark offered coffee. A financial advisor sat at the dining table with a neatly organized folder. Everything appeared professional, thoughtful, and carefully prepared. That was precisely what made it so revealing. Jennifer believed she was guiding me toward a decision that had already been made. I took my seat and smiled politely. The meeting began with charts, projections, and discussions about long-term comfort. The advisor explained the advantages of simplifying responsibilities. Jennifer spoke about reducing stress. Mark nodded along at all the appropriate moments. For nearly 30 minutes, I listened without interruption. Then the conversation shifted exactly where I knew it would. Jennifer began discussing timelines. She spoke about available units at the retirement community we had toured. She mentioned waiting lists. She explained how quickly transitions could occur if paperwork was completed soon. Every sentence sounded reasonable on the surface, yet beneath the carefully selected language was a simple message. They wanted me out of my house. The advisor eventually turned toward me. "Mrs. Dawson, have you given any thought to what you would like to do with the property?" There it was. The question that had been hiding behind weeks of concern and planning. I folded my hands calmly and looked around the room. Jennifer appeared eager. Mark looked nervous. The advisor remained neutral. "Actually," I said, "I have been thinking about property quite a bit lately." Jennifer smiled immediately. "That is great, Mom." I almost felt sorry for her in that moment. Almost. "In fact," I continued, "I have spent the past several weeks reviewing documents, speaking with advisors, and making plans." Jennifer exchanged a quick glance with Mark. They both looked encouraged. The advisor nodded approvingly. "Preparation is always wise," he said. "I agree," I replied. Then I reached beside my chair and lifted a large flat envelope I had brought with me. The room grew noticeably quieter. Jennifer watched with curiosity as I carefully removed several documents. On top of the stack sat a bright sign. Large bold letters stretched across its center. "Sold." Jennifer frowned slightly. "What is that?" she asked. I placed the sign on the table between us. For a brief second, nobody spoke. Mark stared at it. The advisor looked confused. Jennifer blinked several times. "Mom," she said slowly, "what exactly is that supposed to mean?" I met her eyes. "It means I have spent the last few weeks learning things I should have known sooner." Her smile disappeared. The confidence that had filled the room all afternoon began fading almost immediately. I slid the trust documents forward. "You have been very interested in my property," I said calmly. "So I thought it was only fair that we discuss all the property involved." Mark shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Jennifer's expression tightened. For the first time since this began, she looked uncertain. Truly uncertain. I continued speaking in the same calm voice. "No anger. No accusations. Just facts. Before he passed away, your father created protections for our family that you never fully understood." Jennifer stared at the documents. The color slowly drained from her face. The advisor looked from me to her and back again. Nobody seemed quite sure what would happen next. That was fine, because after weeks of watching Jennifer prepare her version of the future, the moment had finally arrived for her to learn about the future Thomas had prepared instead. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. Jennifer stared at the trust documents as if they had appeared from nowhere. Mark looked equally stunned. The financial advisor quietly leaned back in his chair, suddenly realizing he was witnessing a conversation far different from the one he had expected. I remained calm. There was no reason to raise my voice. The facts were doing all the work for me. Your father believed in planning ahead, I said gently. That is why he created protections for the family years ago. Jennifer picked up the first document and scanned the pages. I watched her confidence disappear line by line. She had spent weeks assuming she understood the situation. Now she was discovering there were pieces she had never known existed. This cannot be right, she said quietly. Susan, who had joined us by speakerphone earlier that afternoon, responded calmly. The documents are valid and have been reviewed multiple times. The trust structure has remained in place for years. Jennifer lowered the papers. For the first time since this entire situation began, she looked genuinely uncertain. Not angry, not defensive, just uncertain. That uncertainty revealed something important. She had expected control. Instead, she had found consequences. I folded my hands and looked directly at my daughter. I want to ask you something. She nodded slowly. Why were you so determined to move me out of my home? Her eyes immediately dropped toward the table. The silence stretched longer this time. Finally, Mark spoke. His voice sounded tired. We were struggling financially. Jennifer closed her eyes briefly. Then she nodded. More than we wanted anyone to know. The truth emerged gradually over the next several minutes. Failed investments. Debt that had grown faster than expected. Monthly obligations becoming harder to manage. Fear. About the future. None of it excused what had happened, but it explained it. They had convinced themselves they were helping me while quietly hoping my assets would solve problems they could not solve themselves. When they finished speaking, I felt something unexpected. Not triumph. Sadness. Deep sadness. Because this was never really about property. It was about trust. If you had come to me honestly, I said, I would have listened. I have helped you before. Jennifer wiped at her eyes and nodded. She knew I was right. The hardest part was not the financial situation. The hardest part was realizing she had chosen manipulation instead of honesty. After a long silence, I slid the sold sign aside and gathered the documents. I am not selling my house, I said. I am not moving anywhere. I am healthy, independent, and fully capable of making my own decisions. Neither Jennifer nor Mark argued. They could not. The facts were clear. Then I added the most important part. I am also not interested in controlling your lives. The trust exists to protect the family, not punish it. But from this point forward, every decision involving family assets will be handled with complete transparency. Jennifer nodded again. This time there was no performance in her expression. No carefully rehearsed concern. Just a daughter finally confronting the reality of her choices. Several months have passed since that meeting. I still live in the same house Thomas and I built together. I still walk 3 miles every morning. I still volunteer twice a week. Jennifer and I speak regularly. Although our relationship is different now. More honest. More careful. Trust, once damaged, takes time to rebuild. But at least it is being rebuilt on truth instead of assumptions. Sometimes people ask whether I regret uncovering everything. The answer is simple. No. Because growing older does not mean surrendering your judgment. It does not mean allowing others to decide your future. And it certainly does not mean giving away your dignity. The greatest lesson I learned was one Thomas understood long ago. The strongest position in life is not having the most money or the most power. It is knowing who you are, standing calmly in the truth, and refusing to let anyone else write the ending to your story.